Pocket watches had an incredible run. Being the main form of portable timekeeping for centuries, most of the important innovations and inventions that wristwatches profit from today were first developed for pocket watches. Today, pocket watches don't seem to have a commercial relevance anymore. They barely exist in the press and journalism of the watch world, and nobody really seems to pay much attention to them really. But is that a fact? Pocket watches used to be a very popular field of collecting, but has that changed? It seems so. And if so, why? With about 450 years of history, there are millions upon millions of pocket watches around. But who buys them today and who will buy them in the future? Recently, I think I noticed increasing chatter here and there that pocket watches are about to make a comeback in a collecting sense. Voices in podcasts, watch publications and blogs. But what's with that? And what are the odds that this will happen? What are your thoughts and ideas regarding this topic? Feel free to write a comment down in the comment section. In my opinion, your ideas and feedback offer great value to me and all the other viewers and help to gain a broader and collective understanding for topics like this. And I really appreciate your opinion and your comment. In this video, we will deal with the history of the collector's market for pocket watches. We will look at what the collector's market for pocket watches is today. We will look at the pros and cons of collecting and owning pocket watches, and if pocket watches are really actually having a comeback. Nothing in this video obviously is intended as investment advice. This video and the information contained in it are purely for entertainment and educational purposes only. I just wanted to get this out there. Pocket watches have been the subject of collecting basically as long as they exist. Early on, watches were commissioned by the rich and powerful and often became objects in collections right away when they were produced. They were something to show off and to present and gather alongside other important objects. The collector's market in the second half of the 20th century went through different phases. Interestingly, the path it took was in many ways similar to how the market for wristwatches behaves, which I think is kind of funny, although that happened on a much smaller level for pocket watches because obviously there was not like a worldwide market for it and there was also not the internet. But with the beginning of the 21st century, I think the collector's market for pocket watches began to soften in general, like for general pieces. And if I'm right, prices adjusted to inflation have generally and on average also gone down. I think the main reason is that focus shifted to wristwatches, and many of the original pocket watch collectors sadly passed away in the last 20 years, which leaves us with the question, what does the market for pocket watches look like today? Today, I think there are less and less collectors in the Western world, and my suspicion is that a substantial part of collectors for pocket watches today might come from Asia and the Middle East. But honestly, as I said, that is a suspicion of mine. I also think that brands carry the market today, but I also have to say they don't carry the market all the way through. One example is pocket watches by Patek Philippe are no doubt more valuable than other pocket watches, but a pocket watch from Patek Philippe across the board are not comparable in terms of price to wristwatches from Patek. So they rank sort of lower, but within the pocket watch market, obviously the brand name of Patek Philippe drives the price. Same with A.Lange and Söhne and other brands. Aside from truly exceptional pieces, most pocket watches represent, unfortunately, not much more than the value of the materials they are made from. And that also has a positive side of some sort, and it sort of limits your losses. So if the market goes into a downturn, you're still have the value of the material. So in many cases, you barely pay more for the watch than the gold is worth within it. The dark side about this is that in order to realize that material value, you would have to destroy the watch in most cases. And unfortunately, this is something that happens every day, thousands and thousands of times. A good comparison here for the fact that something that is old is not necessarily valuable are ancient Roman copper coins. There are perhaps hundreds of thousands of them, and although they are 2,000 years old, they can be bought rather cheaply. They're not that expensive just because there are so many of them. In fact, they are often melted down to create fake ancient bronze statues. Whenever there's something in abundance, prices and value usually drops. The market for pocket watches today is probably best explained when compared to the classic car market. For the sake of the argument, let's say that a 1960s vintage wristwatch is equivalent to a Ferrari 275 GTB4, to make matters complicated. I'm sorry. A good and valuable pocket watch probably then would be the equivalent to a 1920s Bentley or something like that. Or to make it even more obvious, a Porsche 911 versus a 1920s Ford Model A. The Ferrari and the Porsche, aka the wristwatch, can be used every day to some degree, while everything from a simple service to an oil change to tires to replacement parts and repair in general is an absolute hassle with the older Model A and Bentley or Packards or whatever. But we will talk more about that in a minute when we talk about the pros and cons of pocket watches. In the meantime, I would like to give a quick shout out to the auction house Dr. Crott for allowing the use of pictures from their catalogs and archives in this video. And this helped me tremendously in making this video and to illustrate the different types of pocket watches. And I simply asked them if I could use the photos from their catalog and website, and they agreed. And all they asked for was to be credited as the source of the photos. And of course, I more than gladly do that. So thank you again to the auction house Dr. Crott for making this video possible. Let's talk about the pros and cons of owning and collecting pocket watches, because actually owning and collecting pocket watches can be pretty much a different thing than owning mechanical wristwatches. And let's start with the pros. One of the interesting things about pocket watches is that they go back in time 300 years more than wristwatches, which makes the evolution of pocket watches and the different variations of pocket watches much more interesting and vast, for lack of a better word. Aside from the question if pocket watches are a good investment in the financial sense, pocket watches are a great opportunity to own highly complex and very highly crafted watches in general, because they are often less expensive than their technically equal wristwatches. If you compare prices between pocket watches and wristwatches, where can you own a quarter repeating watch for $1,000? Probably not in a wristwatch. Same with full calendar movements, different escapement systems, tourbillons. But unfortunately, aside from the interesting history and the diversity of the watches, these are pretty much all the pros. The cons, unfortunately, are plentiful. Opposite to mechanical wristwatches, pocket watches have a very limited use case, which sort of limits the appeal to collectors because, you can't really wear them. The pocket watches need certain clothing to be worn in a position where they do not get damaged easily. And wearing a pocket watch in your jeans pocket is not how that was intended. And certainly the dirt in your pocket will not do good to the watch. If you don't have a dedicated pocket to wear your pocket watch, then it's very difficult to wear these watches without damaging them. Keeping them at home is one thing, but one of the practical appeals of wristwatches is that you can just pick them up and wear them. The situation for repairs and replacement parts for pocket watches is a lot more difficult than it is for most wristwatches. And the reason for that is not only that pocket watches go much more back in time, it's also that even within the early industrialization, many of the parts in pocket watches were not exchangeable with other parts from a different movement of the same type. That means that if you have a pocket watch and you break something, it will be very difficult to find either a replacement part or in fact a replacement part that fits the watch without having to be manipulated to fit into it, which makes owning them a lot more expensive and servicing them a lot more expensive. The other thing is that the movements themselves are often a lot more delicate and need a lot more care handling them. And the reason for that is that generally those pocket watches are made from, let's say for lack of a better word, more primitive materials. Alloys and all kinds of materials were not advanced as they later were with mechanical wristwatches. So we're mostly looking at traditional materials, old school steel, especially within the mainspring, other small springs within the mechanism, and also with the balance springs. And because these materials are a little bit more primitive, they tend more to fatigue, and fatigue breaks and cracks. Obviously, that is something that happens also with wristwatches, no question about that, especially with early wristwatches. But pretty much all materials within a pocket watch are not as high performing as they are in mechanical wristwatches. And because obviously pocket watches are in use for a much longer time, usually things also simply just wear down within the movement. So as a quick conclusion, owning pocket watches can have many benefits and it can be very interesting and fulfilling, but also you're dealing with a lot of the things that you don't necessarily have to deal to that much of a high degree within wristwatches. And that comes back to the comparison that I made earlier, that, you know, pocket watches are a little bit more like very, very early automobiles, where there are basically no spare parts left, where a lot of the measurements are different from one car to another car, and where you have to put a lot more work into keeping them going, and at the same time they are not as practical as, let's say, a later car. So the last question is, are pocket watches having a comeback? If you just look at their financial value, I think just a very, very small part of the pocket watches on the market are really valuable and therefore sought after. I think there will always be specialized collectors for certain pieces and certain categories of pocket watches, but I would say they will remain a limited bunch. There will not be many, many people who do this in the future. At the moment, it seems like that wristwatches obviously are, you know, the main focus of the market, and if that will change, honestly, I don't know. For pocket watches in general, I would say the auction prices in the last couple of years are more or less falling a little bit, and for many pieces, I already said the market value is very little more than the material that they are made from, silver or gold. Then we have the fact that many old school collectors are unfortunately passing away, which brings huge amounts of pocket watches to the market, which again has the tendency to sort of like dilute the market, which again sort of like pushes prices down. And I believe because we live in a world where demographic change is happening, there will be many, many more people who want to get rid of pocket watches than people who will buy them. I think pocket watches are a very complex but fun topic. Most of them I think are quite interesting for various reasons. They don't really speak to me as a collector item, but I'm also recently biased towards pendulum clocks. So, you know, most of the pocket watches represent great watchmaking value for the money, but I personally would not necessarily expect them to rise in value in the next years. In fact, I think that in the next 10 to 15 years, a lot more pocket watches will come to market, which I already said. And what will happen is very difficult to say, and I think a YouTube video like this won't find the answers to that. It might give a glimpse or some ideas, but in fact I don't have the magic crystal ball either, so we will have to wait and see, and in the end everyone will have to make up their own mind. But I hope there were some interesting ideas in this video, and if you want to leave me a feedback in form of a comment, feel free to do this. I very much appreciate it, and I hope to see you in the next video.